Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Amita Bide from Tata Institute of Social Sciences, and today we will be discussing the module on challenges and future of critical community practice as a part of the paper on community organization. We have tried to understand so far what is critical community practice, how critical community practice in India is very different from the way in which this concept is just now being introduced in the context of UK. And we have tried to understand how the concepts of power and the concept of power is so very critical to the entire notion of critical community practice. What are the different perspectives on power and empowerment? But this brings us to a very important point, and which is that if critical community practice in India has been existing for a very long time, then similarly the challenges that this faces, the challenges that it poses, the new questions that it raises are also very different from the kind of questions which are being raised in the Western context. So this module basically outlines some of these challenges. We are not going to give answers to how these challenges should be met, because each of these challenges requires and necessitates a creative response which perhaps is part of the entire pedagogy and the praxis of critical community practice itself. So what are these challenges? Some of these are challenges perhaps which have also been recognized in the past, and therefore they are old challenges. But at the same time, new challenges to critical community practice have also evolved. So broadly, what we can say is that there are challenges which are linked to an external context which is changing. A second set of challenges which is linked to the internal context of organizations and links to how organizations themselves are embedded in society and social relations and how they reflect those social realities. The third is those set of challenges which are linked to the immediate communities with which organizations actually try to work. So we treat these challenges really as a set of dialectics through which organizations, practitioners have to basically deal with, make choices and think through. So one of the first and very interesting challenges which emerges from a changing context is talking about the entire national versus global orientation. For a very long time, the idiom or the phrase which was used very popularly by several practitioners of critical community practice was think global, act local. What this meant was basically that while being aware of the several ties between transnational sites, the kind of ways in which development narratives were evolving, one needs to have that kind of perspective, but at the same time, the site of engagement had to be local, and this is therefore something which was very clearly followed. What has happened in recent times? Recent times have made us realize that translocal relationships, building those alliances between local issues and trying to see them through an international perspective, transcending sometimes national boundaries, entails both risks, it also entails opportunities. So the kind of opportunities that one sees are basically that one is able to seek alliances and speak a language of human rights, which often is not something which is completely respected within national boundaries. But the risk here is of exposing critical practice to attacks within their own countries. and it also makes practitioners, organizations vulnerable to questions about their legitimacy in order to represent their own constituents. And I think therefore this is one of the very, very important dilemmas, challenges as one moves forward, especially because world over now there seems to be a trend towards increasing expression of and rise, almost like an upsurge of nationalist kind of sentiments. A second challenge linked to this is perhaps the area of the relationship with the state. In India, the post-colonial state has, or rather the emergence of the state perhaps itself, has been through a colonial mode, and therefore it has not been through a social compact, which is often discussed in the context of Western countries, where it is seen that the state emerged in order to take care of certain needs of society. Here, the state came through the imposition of a colonial regime. And while after independence, this state has taken on many, many developmental phases, yet one also sees that the kind of aspirations which have been raised from amongst people, there are several constituents, several sections of society which have also been excluded from this. Now, when critical practice begins to engage with these kind of excluded segments of society, there are very, very real kind of challenges which confront these kind of spaces. How does one relate to a state which sometimes seems to have turned even more violent, which seems to have turned against its own people, its own citizens? At the same time, the presence of the state, the need to engage with the state is perhaps most important for these very constituents, because they themselves lack the resources to influence the directions of development towards themselves. While one is talking about these larger levels, I think what one needs to also recognize is that while for organizations the areas of collaboration seem to have thinned, and while contestation seems to have emerged as a very risky area, at the same time the state is not a very even space. It is not a homogeneous space. The state itself consists of multiple institutions, multiple levels, and there are many contradictions existing within the same. And therefore, one also sees some new spaces emerging. For example, the entire space that has emerged for environmental movements through the National Green Tribunal. A National Green Tribunal which is pursuing and responding to several sentiments of communities which are at the receiving ends of both a degenerating environment and social justice. The relationship with the state has therefore become much more complex, much more granular, and therefore practitioners of critical practice constantly need to navigate this entire terrain of relationship with the state. Something which is, I think, a continuation of the entire challenge of the past as well, but continues into the present, is the entire dialectic between whether one follows an ideology and perpetuates and takes that forward, advances that in the field, or whether one uses more value-based systems. What is ideology, and what has been the role of ideology in the entire realm of critical community practice? Ideology gives a long-term vision for change, and from that point of view, It guides the analysis of contemporary society, the power structures within society. It also guides a vision of how to bring about change and what kind of change to actually bring in. So ideology can play a very, very important role, especially in critical community practice. On the other hand, the rote application, a routinized, a dogmatic perhaps application of ideology is often counterproductive. It can also be very divisive, and in a dynamic environment, particularly, the application of ideology which has been cast in a particular time and age can also be extremely and can produce and can be out of sync of current day realities. And therefore, there seems to be also a growing inclination to not move towards ideology based practices, but instead a inclination to actually value values and operationalize these key values through an ongoing process of reflection and praxis. What is the way to go? I think therefore this remains a very, very important challenge as well. Another very interesting challenge, again perhaps a continuation from the past, is to look at the entire question of identities, something which plays a very, very key role in the context of India. And whether one uses traditional identities or whether one should use and form new collective identities. In this connection, perhaps we need to understand what is the role of tradition itself. And I would suggest that tradition plays a very complex and a very vexing role. On one hand, tradition offers several modes of sustainable management, of natural resources in particular, but also of sustaining a social fabric, which is a very, very important support system for many excluded groups. Just to give one example here, there are several parts in our country where there have been traditional water management systems and these or waste management systems, and these water management systems have actually existed not through any codified law or through a system of finances, but merely through a system of social relations. And these have been crucial in areas which are drought prone or also near a desert kind of areas. There is a value therefore to them. There are social fabric sustaining relations and traditions. In Konkan in Maharashtra, there are fisher folks in which families in which there are no earning members or where there are no male members in a productive age group are actually given a share of the total catch of the village, and this is a system which has existed for centuries together. These are very, very interesting and important aspects of tradition, but at the same time, traditions have also systemically oppressed several social groups. For example, when you look at Dalits, and therefore there are many groups, there are many critical practitioners who have adopted a cultural approach that builds new social identities, new collective identities, which can offer people strength and which can give people new ideas and new values. In an organization which worked with tribals in Thane district, one of the practices that it started was to say Zindabad instead of the traditional greeting of saying Ram Ram, which is used and very prevalent in Maharashtra. What is the advantage of saying Zindabad over Ram Ram? Is it that everyone is constantly in a protest mode? No. But it's basically that one bows down one's head when one says Ram Ram. On the other hand, one lifts up one head and also kind of builds up one's shoulder when one is saying Zindabad. It is an assertion of the self as opposed to a Ram Ram, which is bowing down to another person. And therefore, in the context of the tribal to the non-tribal relationship, which has always been very, very dominating, the entire idiom of Zindabad gives the tribal strength. It helps to build up a new assertion in relationship to the other stronger, more dominating systems of domination in the village. But we need to recognize that there are both potentials to these kind of new identities. There are also limits to those, because these are getting constructed as opposed to traditions which are already embedded within an overall social fabric. There are, of course, new challenges emerging, because now the context within which critical community practice unfolds are becoming more and more multicultural. How does one build solidarities in this area? How does one work with differences and yet produce new kinds of unities? Is the way to go in terms of assuming a false unity or consensus? Or is it important to build a difference before moving on to build a new basis of solidarity? Several questions, no clear answers, but this remains a very, very important area of challenge. A very important arena of dialectics is the kind of knowledge which is used, which kind of flows through the organization, and what is actually valued, and whether it is grassroots knowledge or whether it is more formal knowledge. And this is important because several dominated groups carry the knowledge of their oppression and it is reflected within their culture. But on the other hand, they are very, very silenced by the strength of the oppressive system. It's important, therefore, that they begin to speak from their own experience and begin to think critically. On the other hand, and if you look at formal education in that sense, formal education, especially the way in which it has been introduced in India, the kind of languages, the kind of tools and the kind of institutions and their practices through which it is perpetuated, it actually advances the overall silencing process by alienating people from their own culture and their own language as well. How does this actually reflect in organizations and in organizational practices and the way practice takes it on? As Robert Chambers points out, this can become a very, very important barrier to development in many, many contexts. And it is so necessary to privilege local knowledge, and not just at a grassroots level, but at multiple levels in the organization. For organizations and practitioners, this can become an extremely important challenge, because for their own sustenance, organizations also require a knowledge of English. Even in terms of advancing their own representation, you also require these kind of formal knowledges. So therefore, there is a coexistence of this kind of a formal knowledge regime and a local knowledge regime, which always exists with multiple practitioners. And therefore, a challenge is, how do we value this? How do we give a face to the very real question of whose reality, whose knowledge actually counts? And this has to be done not at one point in time, not just as a formal declaration of intent, but actually through the kinds of ways in which this organization operates, through which practitioners practice in an ongoing manner. Organizations are never isolated. So while they may think about bringing about social change, they are very much rooted and embedded in those very social contexts, and as a result of which, one important arena of dialectic is the entire dialectic between hierarchy versus equality or equity. Many organizations embrace and value equality and equity. But on the other hand, the very deep-rooted hierarchy and inequality which exists in Indian society translates into a gap within the context of practice itself. So often one would see that there are gaps between organizational leaders and the people at the grassroots. There are socio-economic gaps, there are cultural gaps, and there are also class gaps. Having acknowledged this reality, I think the dialectic is about how do organizations address these gaps. Whether this gap itself becomes a site for creative and reflective practice. How does one translate the goals of equity which are stated into the own structure of the organization itself? How do organizations navigate all the exigencies and the demands of the regulatory environment, the aid environment, which also seem to perpetuate this kind of a gap between those who are leaders and then those who kind of are at the grassroots? And therefore, this becomes an interplay of ongoing reflection and action. An extension perhaps of this same dialectic is to move into the entire area of leadership versus institutionalization. One can see that in India, there are so many experiments in critical community practice which are unique and which often remain non-replicable, and they are also non-scalable. Similarly, you will see that organizations remain individual-centered, very leader-focused one should say, and there are limitations on sustainability therefore. The question is, how do we transcend the dependence on one leaders? And are organizational designs, practice designs robust enough to do the same? One sees that the perpetuation of this leadership and single person leadership is linked to the overall structure of aid systems as well, which privilege English language proficiency, which privilege formal education, which privilege particular modes of expression, which necessitate an ongoing participation in international forums. But at the same time, one sees that if one has to remain relevant to local realities, if one has to think of sustainability of efforts, scalability of efforts, then one needs to go beyond this single person focus. Another important aspect that one needs to consider here is that often one thinks about institutionalization, often one thinks of attempt to scale up efforts, but these are not backed up by good research, which recognizes the particularity of conditions in which some attempts, some efforts, some designs have become successful. So you may have a best practice within a particular context, but that best practice turns out to be a worst practice in another context. So in order to be scalable in heterogeneous conditions, one needs to really back up good practice efforts with good research as well. Another area, perhaps which is also relevant to the Western context, is the entire area of critical learning versus consolidation. Hugh Butcher talks about critical learning as actually being one of the hallmarks of critical community practice. And critical practice is linked to critical thinking. However, when practice takes the shape of an organization, there are new challenges, because this becomes, when practitioner turns into an organization, an institution, that organization itself develops its own stakes, develops its own demands. It could be linked to a regular demand for certain kind of resources. It could be particular kinds of politics, and engaging with politics which is risk averse, and therefore the entire aspect of organization has to really balance learning on one hand, on the other hand the embedding of processes into institutions on another. There are modes in which one can keep on engaging in an ongoing learning process, such that you can do periodic review with communities, you can have peer exchanges, you can also have externals involvement in field visits and using them as triggers really for reflection at multiple levels. So you can think of multiple methods in order to do that, but the will to do that has to be something which has to be respected within the organizational context itself. We've looked at multiple dialectics of critical community practice in India, but I think what is necessary in order to also look towards the future, and what kind of shape would critical community practice take place in the future in India, I think it is very important to perhaps look at the entire difference in which critical practice has evolved in the West, in the global North, and in the global South. And then there can be a considerable interlearning which is possible between both of these contexts. So in the global North, one sees that critical practice has emerged in the entire context of a reducing presence of the welfare state. It is also clubbed with the entire emergence of or the threat of negation of the state in welfare spaces and the emergence of private sector in these kind of spaces. Similarly, there is also the entire context of immigration in these societies, which has made several localities extremely transnational. And therefore, these are societies which are now beginning to think about how does one engage with communities which are changing their entire locus standi, where the state is no longer the central actor or the pinnacle, nor is practice backed up in some ways by this authority of the state. How does one pose oneself in relation to this? On the other hand, in India, one sees that it is not just, it's basically the absence of the state in not just welfare but also developmental aspects, which has compelled community practice to really adopt a transformative stance, and which has existed for a very, very long time. And taking this kind of a relationship ahead, where civil society experiences, where transformative experiences have engaged in a very turbulent relationship with the state, and today have reached a state where several efforts, grassroots efforts of critical community practice have reached that stage where they have become a part of larger coalitions of change. Some of these have morphed really into more conventional development practice. There are others which have become more closer to electoral politics. There are others which have kind of adopted a more non-party political kind of a stance. One has seen that transformative efforts have been able to deliver material changes for the people concerned, very, very highly excluded people. They have also been able to create a space for development that really recognizes the aspirations of those at the bottom. But on the other hand, The space for these actions is also increasingly seen as anti-state. There is a lack often of ongoing reflexivity which affects the internal democracy and inclusion within organizations and within the kind of practices adopted by people. There are very few efforts which actually retain ongoing links with academia, or one also sees academia retaining very few or having very fragile links with practice itself. And it is in this context that one thinks of the future scenario. It is very possible that critical community practitioners may find themselves in a double jeopardy in the global south, because they face the challenge of retaining the praxis at the local level. At the same time, they have to strengthen their practice against the grain of an increasingly constrained national and global space. So the future is going to be full of challenges, but at the same time, there are also new emergent spaces. And one of the most promising emergent space and factors is that there is the availability of newly educated youth amongst the erstwhile oppressed groups. And these can bring a fresh perspective and an entirely new resource onto the table, which can perhaps address many of the gaps and the contradictions that we have discussed earlier. For references, please look up the text. Thank you.